Hello Higher Historians and welcome to the last lesson in issue 2 of the Scottish topic, Migration and Empire. By now we've looked at the 5 key immigrant groups that came to Scotland, and we've had a chat about who they were, why they maybe came into Scotland, and what their lives were actually like here, and how well they got on with the Scottish people and assimilated to Scottish culture, and how the Scottish people reacted to them. If you haven't done this already, you need to go back because you've obviously missed some lessons out. What you should have now is little mini fact files or mini posters or whatever it is you've done and created with each of the different groups. So far we've got Catholic Irish, Protestant Irish, we've got Italians, Jewish and Lithuanians, and those are your 5 kind of key groups that you're talking about in the exam. This lesson gives you a little bit more information about the attitude towards immigrants by the Scottish people and thinking about how they reacted to them in general. So it might be a bit of a recap for things that you've already said, or it might be some new information. Issue 2 is all about the immigrant groups that came to Scotland during the 1800s and 1900s, which is what we've been looking at. These top 5 groups that we now have built up our fact files about did come in rather large numbers, and the reality was that many Scots opposed this general migration. But there was some that did welcome it. They were very happy and delighted to see the changes that these new people would make in Scotland and happy to have them here. Now, realistically speaking, Scotland is a rather large, diverse melting pot of different cultures, traditions and peoples. And this is really where this is starting to happen and really be a thing for the first time. So it's a really key point in looking at our Scotland today, how it got to be this, and the things that we enjoy as part of our culture is all about these different groups that came in and the influence of other issues that we're going to look at as well. For this lesson, what you're going to do is look at the PowerPoint and go through this video. And basically you're going to either build a mind map, it could be just a nice big mind map, or if you are enjoying your mini fact files you can do the same that you did for the rest of issue 2, that is going to summarise the attitudes of the Scottish people towards these immigrant groups. There are 6 areas that we're looking at with this, which are the 6 main arguments about immigration, and it tended to be the following things. It was all about the living conditions that Scottish people were in and how they saw the immigrant groups reacting to this and kind of adding to the stress of the living conditions. Again, the jobs and the wages, which we've talked about quite a bit, really important. Again, same with the religion. It's the integration with Scots, so how well these immigrant groups actually tried to assimilate, which is the word we use, so get involved in Scottish society and become part of that collective idea. And we're also thinking about the stereotypes that existed about the immigrant groups and how the Scottish people would react to them. And then also the impact of both the First and the Second World War. So choose how you're going to do this. It's entirely up to you. You do not have to send a picture of this one this time for this week for the assignment, but you do have to kind of have something for your notes where it is really obvious that this is what it is and this is where you can find it if you need it, and you will need to use it for the task that you do have to do for this assignment. So heading number 1, living conditions. Now, as you can see from the picture, which is just a stereotypical tenement building in one of the Scottish cities at the period in time, and there's some nice little babies there in a pram having a rather scary looking conversation with each other. But anyway, this kind of living condition looks rather run down. You can see that the windows are boarded up, some of the sort of windows don't have any glass in them, it looks kind of dirty, you know, the garden green bit where they're obviously drying their clothes and things like that doesn't look very clean. Some of the different bits of it are quite damp looking. And these types of living conditions were very common in Scotland in sort of slum areas or the poorer areas of the cities. And anybody who did 3rd year history and came on our 3rd year history trip as well, you'll remember that we talked about the closes and things like that and what these would look like. Or if you've been to Edinburgh dungeons, you kind of will see that idea as well. But living conditions are generally not particularly good for most of the sort of working class and poorer people living in Scotland in general. So the immigrant groups didn't actually have anything to do with this. They just added to the stress and the overcrowding in these areas because this was all that they could afford. And it made it really very difficult for Scottish people to campaign for new conditions or better conditions when there were just an abundance of lots of people who would move into these areas, or at least so they would argue. So your first heading is the living conditions. Make a heading someplace, or if you're doing a mind map, that's your first point on the mind map, and then you're going to fill in your details. So generally speaking, many Scottish people were opposed to immigration due to the concerns that it would be very costly for society. And this comes back to the idea of poverty. By the end of issue 2, I'm going to learn how to use this highlighter properly. Many immigrants were poor, and the Scottish people were very afraid that they would have to come into Scotland and rely on the charities that existed in Scotland, which generally meant that there would be less available for the Scottish poor people to actually engage with. Now, this wasn't the case. The poor laws and things like that said you had to live in Scotland for about 3 to 5 years before you could even qualify for any sort of assistance, and they tended not to actually rely on Scottish charity as much as their own community charity, but this is how they kind of felt. Generally as well, many immigrants lived in these sort of poor areas, which is what we were just saying, with very poor quality housing, so they kind of got a reputation as being poor, mucky, dirty, things like that, but also this ultimately led to overcrowding of these areas, and in these particular communities it caused a lot of resentment because the Scottish people again were feeling like they needed to have less of these people coming in, taking houses and space, that meant their lives were then made a little bit worse by the overcrowding. Now, it wouldn't have mattered which group it was that had come in and did this, it just mattered that they were being crowded in these poorer areas. So it's quite a negative sort of reaction from them at this point. However, my smiley fist moment number 1, it isn't actually always negative because many immigrants actually built links with the Scots and became involved, as we've seen, in political campaigns to try and improve the general standard of living across Scotland, and they also campaigned for improved housing and working conditions. And a good example of this is Irish immigrants who helped set up the Scottish Labour Party, who were very keen on trying to ensure better conditions for everyone. Also, it's a good point to mention that people in Scotland were actually glad, some of them, to see these immigrant groups coming in, especially if they were ones that had any sort of family or friendship connections to the groups or the people coming in, because they felt that they were reconnecting with that part. And a lot of people also argued that the poor living conditions, including me a minute ago, actually already existed in Scotland, and it wasn't the fault of the immigrants at all. These conditions were already there. It just so happened that because a lot of them were coming from poverty, looking to escape that, this was the best that they could afford. Now, some, like the other Jewish groups and things like that, managed to move to more affluent areas, the Italians and things as well, and some of the Irish and the Protestant Irish as well. So they weren't always in these overcrowded places, but generally this is kind of a positive point. So for your mind map, you might maybe want to do some of the more negative points in, say, red, or go around it in red or something like that, and then do the more positive points about the reactions in green. It's up to you how you do it, but make sure that you can see that there are two kind of sides to each point. Okay, so new heading piece on your mind map is all about jobs and wages. Now, we've talked a lot about the jobs and wages and talked about how a lot of them were used as strike breakers and things as well. So some of this information might not be new, so make sure you're summarising it the best that you can. So the Scottish workers were actually very worried about the impact of immigration on workplaces. They thought that what they saw is foreign workers would come in and take their jobs from them. Now, this was made worse by the fact that the Irish and Lithuanian immigrants were actually used as strike breakers, because that's what it looked like they were doing. It's not their fault. They don't know that these are not jobs that they can take and have, because they're obviously being recruited by the agencies. But for the Scottish people who were fighting for better rights and better situations, this really looked like they were trying to take those jobs away, and they resented them for this. There is also a kind of a a lot of resentment, which I'm going to try and do in blue here, about the impact that the immigrant workers were going to have on wages, which is what was said as well. Many immigrant workers were prepared to work for lower wages by Scottish standards. It was often higher wages than what they were getting in their home countries. So this forced Scottish people to also accept these lower wages or risk being fired from their jobs. And this caused a lot of anger from the Scots because they were really thinking that it was at a point they were trying to campaign for better wages, but they couldn't do this if there were workers willing to work for lower wages as well. However, smiley face moment, a lot of the employers in Scotland actually welcomed these immigrant groups and were very happy to have them come in because they argued that there was severe labour shortages. A lot of Scottish people had decided to actually move abroad and go to other countries, which we'll look at in issue 3, but it meant that someone needed to take over these jobs, or a lot of Scottish people had now started to go into more skilled labour jobs, which meant that the unskilled jobs needed someone to do them. So many, as we also saw in this, actually advertised to attract workers in places like Ireland and Lithuania, paid for travel costs to try and get them to come over and work in these spaces. Also, as we've actually seen, a lot of the immigrants eventually would join or set up their own trade union. So for example, the Irish set up the Glasgow Cotton Spinners Association, which campaigned and helped to improve the working conditions alongside the Scottish, and that then helped improve their relationship because they were all working towards the same goal, which was these improved conditions. So this helped them to assimilate and be part of Scottish society and be accepted. Okay, new heading then, religious issues. Okay, so we're thinking about the main religious arguments in Scotland at this point in time. So in the early 1800s and the early 1900s, we've already said that Scotland was a Protestant country. Many of the immigrant groups that are coming in are either Catholic, so the Irish, Italians, Lithuanians are all Catholic, or they're Jewish, so the Jewish and the Lithuanian Jews, and this sometimes causes a lot of resentment because it comes into conflict with the Scottish people who are very opposed to alternative beliefs to Christianity, to the Protestant Christianity faith. So many of them were either Catholic or Jewish, and this sometimes caused this level of resentment with them. And again, I will learn to use this highlighter a little bit better later on. Also, we've got this issue that some of the working habits caused religious offence to the native Scots. So for example, the Jewish people and the Italians would conduct business or would work on Sundays, which were considered the Sabbath day, and they would, sell goods or open their cafes at this point in time, and this caused conflict with the Protestant Scots because they believed that no one should actually work on the Sabbath. They were very against people working from that. However, smiley face point, the fact that these cafes did open on a Sunday was a very welcome thing by some in Scottish society, especially the Scottish temperance movement. So the temperance movement were people who were against drinking alcohol, and they argued that the cafes opening provided an alternative that meant that people didn't have to necessarily just go to the pub, which is where they would go, and because they weren't in the pub, they wouldn't be drinking as much alcohol, which was good for Scottish society as a whole. Also, despite it being an issue for many, the fact that many of the immigrants were Catholic was actually a welcome thing for the very small Catholic population in Scotland, because it allowed the Catholic Church to expand and gain more members, and then meant that they felt more comfortable about practicing their religion because there were others who were part of that same faith. And this led to quite a lot of quite easy connection between the Scottish people and the Catholics that were coming in. Okay, so new heading, integration with the Scots, so how well they actually got involved in Scottish society and became part of Scottish society. Okay, so starting off with the negative point here, Many Scottish people also really disliked the fact that these immigrants would live in their own separate communities and they didn't try to fully blend in or integrate or assimilate with Scottish society. Now, a lot of this was due to the areas that they actually lived in. The languages they spoke made it difficult sometimes to integrate because they couldn't understand one another, or they had different religious customs or cultural traditions, and it made them feel very alien and not part of Scottish society, which meant they felt quite lonely, so stayed within their communities for protection. But from the Scottish point of view, this looked like they were purposely trying not to get involved and not to be involved, which again was very, very negative. Intermarriage within the immigrant communities was actually also encouraged. So in the Italian and the Jewish communities, this meant that you were always kind of within that community. That's where you were dating and socialising and things like that, and that annoyed a lot of Scottish people quite a lot because they felt like they were purposely trying to not be with the Scots and that they didn't want to mix with Scottish blood and things like that. Other Scots felt that the immigrants who spoke their own language, so like the Jewish, the Italians, the Lithuanians and some Irish who were speaking Gaelic, actually weren't truly part of Scottish society, and it's back to this age-old kind of speak the language where you are sort of thing. It's very discriminatory and not particularly a nice thing, but that is how they genuinely felt. And again, this level of anxiety led to quite nasty reactions by some Scottish people, not everyone but some, and it then actually led to some immigrant groups becoming further sort of involved in their communities rather than with other particular groups. Finally, some immigrants actually tended to use their own businesses and shops and things like that, or loan companies, things like that, which really irritated the Scots because they felt like this would have an impact on the Scottish economy. So they're opening their businesses and Scottish people are buying from them, but they're refusing to buy from Scottish businesses in return. And again, it's not exactly as clear cut as that, but that is how some of the Scottish people felt and reacted at this point in time. Smiley face moment, however, many immigrants actually did take steps to try to integrate themselves with Scottish society. So we've got examples of some people changing their surname to fit in. We've got other immigrants with families who had marriages with Scottish nationals and became, part of that kind of integrated family unit, which does put a dampener on any resentment because you can't really be against people that are in love and things like that. And also, over time, many of these immigrants became an active part of mainstream Scottish society. So again, they join the trade unions, they support political movements, or they're working to build links and improve the lives for everyone in Scotland, not just them and their community. They become more involved. And things like football teams and stuff that we saw being set up with the other groups, especially with the Irish groups, that helped with that to the point that this is something that we still have today, which is a key part of our society. So this kind of shows how they were able to become involved and linked to Scottish society and benefited Scottish society in general. Okay, so a slightly bigger one here, immigrant stereotypes. So new heading there, immigrant stereotypes. This one's probably one of the key things why there was so much resentment from people at the point that we're looking at. So there were stereotypes about immigrants which caused fear amongst native Scots in general. As many of these immigrants were extremely poor, they arrived in Scotland sometimes wearing rags or generally in quite ill health, they were unwell, and that just was a very negative impression right away, which was very difficult for them to then shift. And it didn't matter if you were a different group of immigrants that were coming in. The fact that you had been seen as an Irish and the Irish immigrants were dirty and ill coming off the boat in Glasgow, and I know this because my friend Morag's best friend's pet guinea pig called Peggy saw them coming off the boat, and this story has now gone all around the whole of the area and the town, and that's what Irish people are like. That created an image in the people of Scotland's minds that was very difficult for any immigrant groups to try and shift. Also, there were a lot of rumours that they were responsible for the spread of disease. Obviously, we're looking for someone to blame, the Irish and the Jews especially, and it meant that many Scottish people just don't want to associate with them, or worse than that, try to actually punish them for spreading these sort of contagious things around. Some people even wanted to ban them actually from coming into the country because they were disease ridden, and it's back to this idea we don't want to take in the paupers of Europe sort of idea. And again, this is not the case, but the stereotype of this disease-ridden, unwell family coming off the boat that maybe has been seen once or twice becomes the normal picture that people think of when they think of immigrants. The Irish people gained a reputation for being drunkards and encouraging poor Scots to drink more alcohol, which annoyed the temperance movement, as you can imagine, and quite often they also gained a reputation for being violent due to riots or fighting that took place between the Catholic and Protestant Irish immigrants, which had been happening in Scotland a little bit before that, but became kind of a more focused thing. And unfortunately then again, if we look back at the football teams being a key point, this actually does lead to some more rivalry, which again we still see today. Back to this idea of the stereotypes that's built on, the Catholic versus Protestant idea. However, smiley face point, many people in Scotland actually knew the reality was that alcohol abuse was a problem in all poor communities across the world, not just Scotland and not just in the immigrant areas of Scotland. So they didn't actually really blame the immigrants for this. And in fact, the Italian cafes offering the alternative, going to the pub, made them a lot more welcomed and kind of helped deal with these ideas. Other groups in particular, like the navvies, who were seen as this very negative, very violent group, were actually not always proven to be violent. They helped build the roads and canals, and you have newspaper stories of the little old wifey next door who's talking to the newspaper about her neighbour who's a navvy and is actually the sweetest, most lovely person that she's ever met, and that these are just silly rumours and things like that. These rumours, again, very common but never actually 100% true. So some of the people in Scotland didn't believe them, others did, and that led to some people accepting the immigrant groups quite readily and other people needing the stereotypes challenged or changed. Impact on war then, kind of a key for this. Smiley face point, so a good thing. The First World War actually played a really good role in helping to improve the relationships between the Scots and the immigrant groups. After the war started, a lot of them, including the Irish Catholics and other groups, joined the army and they fought alongside the Scots, which reduced tensions and it made them part of the same unit. It's really very hard to see someone in a negative light if they've been fighting alongside you in the sort of conditions that the trenches of the First World War actually caused. However, unhappy face point, there were actually also fears during the First World War about the immigrants that were in Scotland. So the Russian Revolution, for example, in 1917, which was partly to do with the war as well in Russia, led to a communist government ruling Russia, and some people in Scotland were really worried about the loyalty of the Lithuanians in particular because they had been from the home country which was in the Russian Empire, and they were worried they would try to start a revolution in Scotland. So this meant that they were quite fearful of them, and the war can kind of add that kind of level of fear of the alien and the alien groups. So some people like that had to actually register with local police stations and check in once a week, which we saw when we were talking about the groups making our fact files. World War II also caused issues for the immigrants and undermined some of the good relationships between them. A really good example of that is the Italians. So because the Italians supported Nazi Germany in the Second World War, there's an awful lot of anger towards the Italians at this point in time, with some of them even being attacked in the streets. Italian businesses are being vandalised, and some of the Italian men were, as we saw in this fact file, were arrested and they were interned, which meant they were held without any crime being committed, purely to prevent them from turning rogue and going back to fight with Italy, or worse, attacking in Scotland on Italy's behalf. Now, this is never necessarily the case, but again, it's back to this idea of fear being the main focus for this. So that's it for the mind map or fact file that you are building, and I have a summary task skills question for you to upload this week. Remember how to do the explain questions, look back at that video if you're not sure. A, B, C and D are required this time, and I've given you a starter sentence just to make your answer a little bit tidier. So for 8 marks, explain why Scots represented immigrant groups to Scotland in the 1800s and 1900s. So you're thinking about all these reasons that we just talked about, and you're going to put them together as an explain question and upload them on the assignment tab. Any questions or anything you're not sure about, give Mr. Keir or me a shout and let us know if you have trouble accessing anything in general.